it do, astronauts? It's Steve Money. Get ready to blast off with a new episode of What It Do. This week, I get the chance to talk again with David Pepose. He is the writer and creator of Spencer Locke. Once I found out about Spencer Locke and picked it up, it quickly became one of my favorite comic book series, and I'm sure it's bound to become one of yours. And if you'd like to find out more about the series Volume 1, go ahead and listen to the What It Do interview I had with David and artist Jorge Santiago Jr. So with that being said, let's get into it. David, what it do? How are you?
Hi, how are you? Thanks so much for having me.
I am good. Thanks for coming back for a second time. The first time, you released so much good information on the show. I had to have you back for even more.
Very excited to talk about Spencer Locke too.
So how have you been since we last talked? How has the whole Spencer Locke universe blown up for you?
I knew that people would talk about Spencer Locke. I wasn't sure if they would love it or hate it. Thankfully, everybody seemed to really love it. We got a ton of great response to it. We were nominated for not one, but 5 awards last year, including for Best Series and Best Writer, which is huge coming from my first book. The way the critical response came, it was just so encouraging. It was so inspiring that we had to get the band back together for a Volume 2. It's been a long time in the making. I've had the idea for our sequel in our back pocket even before I approached artist Jorge Santiago Jr. That's how long I've known where this book was going to go, if the demand was there. Thankfully, it was, and the whole creative team is back, and they are really bringing their A game. They've raised the bar so much higher that you're going to look at Volume 2 and you're going to think, wow, this is way better than Volume 1, and that's exactly the reaction we want.
Well, you always want to build on what you have, but still keep it familiar. And just looking at the teasers you guys have been putting out, especially with Jorge's artwork, It's definitely that, but you can tell it's already elevated.
Yeah, that's elevated is exactly the word that I would use. They talked about in The Dark Knight, or really the end of Batman Begins, they talked about escalation. Cops start wearing bulletproof vests, criminals start, packing armor-piercing slugs. That's definitely the ethos we wanted for Spencer Locke too. We say this is very much our Empire Strikes Back. If our first arc was what if Calvin and Hobbes grew up in Sin City, Spencer Locke 2 goes full fables across the funny pages. Every newspaper comic strip is fair game now, and we are pitting hard-boiled detective Locke and partner, who's an imaginary talking panther named Spencer. We're pitting them against Roach Riley, who's kind of our Heath Ledger-inspired riff on Mort Walker's classic strip Beetle Bailey. So it's very much going to be sort of that unstoppable force meeting the immovable object, and there's going to be some serious sparks flying from that collision.
This cast in the original couple of issues was just a handful of characters. Are you expanding that besides the crossovers? We
are. The thing is that, I was so surprised with how people responded to our supporting cast, and particularly Locke's daughter, Hero. So we're giving her a very meaty arc in this sequel. She is really kind of the beating heart of the series in my mind. Spencer Locke, for those who haven't read the first series, it's very much they're the products of a deeply traumatic childhood. There's a reason why Locke, as an adult cop, still carries this blue stuffed panther with him everywhere he goes. It's his unique coping mechanism for all the horror and abuse he dealt with as a kid. And so when he discovered that he had a daughter of his own, it's a very powerful motivator for him and for Spencer. They both see Hero as what could have been, what their lives could have looked like without all the heartbreak and damage. And so they want to make sure that they build a better future for their kid. The problem is Locke is finding himself in some very precarious place in the beginning of our second arc. And so there's going to be a lot of obstacles to that family reunion. On top of that, we have a new love interest for Locke, Melinda Mercury, who is our riff on Dale Messick's Brenda Starr reporter. As you might guess, a cop having a relationship with a reporter, that feels very risky. And that's in part because Locke is kind of incapable of making good decisions, and in part because Melinda is drawn to damaged people. And so their relationship is going to have some twists and turns going on here as well. When we did the first Spencer Locke, there were certain things that we couldn't do, that I wanted to do, but just the structure of the story wouldn't work that way. In particular, I wanted to have more diversity and representation in the series, but because our first arc was all about Locke and his immediate family, we kind of found ourselves boxed in a little bit. It was sort of, if we had representation, it would have been bad negative representation, which in my mind would have been worse. So we're able to correct that here with Volume 2, particularly with Melinda. She's a female reporter of color, which I thought was very important to have in our series. But also just, giving Hero a little bit more agency as well, making sure that she's not just the hostage du jour, but giving her, some real direction and impact on the rest of the plot.
It seems like you're really fleshing out each character now.
Yeah.
Well, you also have the time to, I feel.
Exactly. You hit it on the head. I mean, we had our first arc to really explore Spencer and Locke's characterization and their past and their histories with one another. And now, people know these characters and they feel invested. And so now we're able to kind of really deconstruct what we've already done with them. For example, Locke, you'd think that he dealt with a lot of the tormentors of his past in as decisively a way as possible. But despite what Hollywood might tell you, you can't shoot your problems into submission. He's feeling very adrift right now because he's confronted all of these childhood tormentors and he still doesn't feel any better. There's no catharsis at the end of a gun. He's trying to find some new direction, and Spencer, as a figment of his imagination, is following suit. He's a little less cuddly, he's a little more restless, in part because of sort of Locke's inner turmoil. Spencer and Locke's dynamic is going to be really tested as they find themselves in some particularly hot water professionally. And the thing is, we get to illuminate a lot about their characterization just by sort of, hitting Locke and Roach against one another. Roach is kind of the what could have been for Locke in the other direction. He's endured just as much suffering and heartbreak as Locke, but it was under a much more accelerated time frame. And whereas Spencer and Locke, I think a lot of their arc is about trying to transcend their scars, trying to move past them, Roach is still there. He saw some things, and we might say that it kind of broke him, but he might say that the scales really fell from his eyes. He's kind of like an apostle. He's almost found religion, except that his religion is pain and suffering. So he's looking to kind of spread that to as many people as possible. Roach is the kind of guy who thinks that he's doing us a favor by hurting us. That kind of nihilism, that's something that Locke is going to have to confront in himself as well. It's not just a physical conflict. It's a war of ideas.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see how that all unfolds. Was so much ready to go for the second arc? Was it hard or difficult to up the ante, or did you still feel like you had some challenges ahead of you?
The hardest thing about our first volume was biting my tongue and not telling anybody that this was the plan all along. When I was a kid, I was reading the funny pages in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and you saw all these different comic strips on the same page. So to me, that escalation of the high concept feels very organic. Why wouldn't you have all these different characters in the same world? We saw them on the same page. That actually it made things a little easier for me. Anytime that I would feel stuck, there was a whole universe of different inspirations that I could draw upon, and so many different archetypes coming from the funny pages that you could say, all right, this could fit this particular niche or this particular side character, or wouldn't it be funny if we did something to Hagar the Horrible or Marmaduke or Dilbert? So that actually wound up being kind of a safety net for me. The thing is, though, is that it always comes down to character. Locke is a supremely fun character to write. He's always I felt that Spencer is me on a good day, Locke is me on a bad day. And so it's always been very fun to explore their characters and what their opinions and perspectives and points of view might be in a certain situation. Roach is just, though, he became my favorite character for this arc. And that's saying something given how much I love Locke. But once I kind of cracked that headspace, the whole story just opened up for me. Roach he's got such a twisted perspective on things. But if you kind of squint, it makes a little bit of sense. There is sort of a weird attractiveness to that nihilism that sort of, when you're in this hopeless place, maybe there is a deeper, more sinister meaning to it. And so, yeah, sort of, finding these characters and their unique perspectives on the world, that really kind of opened up a lot of different possibilities.
Jorge, the artist of the series, definitely had his hand in lots of different types of art in the first run. Did he do the same thing this time around as well?
Yes, I can absolutely say yes. Jorge is just a champ. I mean, a real artist, a true professional. And the thing that I like most about working with him, the thing is, with the first Spencer, I'm like, hindsight's 2020. I didn't know if people were going to like this book. So I wanted to make sure with our first arc, we threw in as much cool stuff as possible because I didn't know if I'd get to write another comic again. And I didn't know if, this comic would tarnish poor Jorge's reputation. So I wanted to make sure that we each had like a good portfolio to come out of this to show, hey, we can do action, we can do emotion, we can do car chases, we can do sci-fi. So the fun part about volume 2 is to say, oh, well, what other cool stuff didn't we hit? Both in terms of Bill Watterson's iconography from Calvin and Hobbes, but also just if I got hit by a bus tomorrow, what kind of comics would I have wanted to have written? And something that Jorge and I have talked about a lot was he very much sees noir and war comics as almost cousins stylistically to one another. I think that was a very cool way to look at it, since there's so much meta commentary in this series. Delving into another side of comics history is particularly fun for me and for him. So Jorge, really, we've got a few new genres that we're playing with here. We've got a little bit of sort of that more chilling horror when dealing with Roach. We get to deal with some more war iconography, since that's the world that Roach is coming from. Without giving too much away, there's another genre that we get to inject into our third issue that I was particularly pleased with how it turned out. I consider this just as much of a remix as I do a sequel. And so being able to kind of throw in all these different influences is, it results in a very fun final product. And I just have to say, Jorge and our colorist Jason Smith, our letterer Colin Bell, our variant cover artists Mon House and Joe Mulvey, I think they were all really encouraged by the response for our first arc. And so they all really kind of upped their game for volume 2. I mean, everybody was working really in sync with this sequel, and honestly, I think it looks better than the first.
It sounds like some eye candy is coming our way, and I can't wait.
Thank you. And when you see all the Easter eggs that Jorge and I threw in there, anybody who's a fan of Nancy, you're probably either going to love or hate our first issue.
What were you able to apply to this go-around that you learned from the last time?
That's a great question. Because part of the reason why it took so long between our first and second arcs is we wanted to make sure that there was demand for a sequel. And we wanted to hear kind of what people thought about our first arc to see if there's anything we wanted to change or play up. And part of it was what I discussed before was just, trying to increase the amount of representation and diversity to our series. And by having a larger cast that does do that. But the other thing that I thought was interesting and something that I really wanted to address in our sequel was a lot of people asked, well, how could Locke ever become a cop? Given how sort of obviously damaged he is, he's a guy who literally hallucinates his best friend 24 hours a day. And that's something we wanted to address in our sequel. Locke is, when we see him in volume 2, he's under suspension because of all the stuff that, he did in our last arc. You don't have a $1 million car chase or a warehouse full of dead henchmen without somebody calling you to account for it, And that's something that we wind up analyzing a lot in our sequel is that violence and trauma don't happen in a vacuum. There's always a consequence to it. There's always a price to be paid. And it's going to be very interesting to see how their relationship evolves now that they're sort of in the hot seat. But also, can they find a compromise? Is there a way that they can navigate our world, or are their scars just going to make them too violent to become an officer or a partner, or in Locke's case, a functioning parent? We're able to kind of subvert a little bit of the action tropes, and by doing so, I think we're able to kind of take this in a very interesting direction.
I'm excited to see where that goes. You said this was your Empire Strikes Back. Now, there was Return of the Jedi. Is there more story to tell with this after the second installment?
If there's the demand, yes. I've actually been telling people that pre-ordering our book actually is more important for Volume 2 than it ever was for Volume 1, because I guarantee when people read Volume 2 and they finish Volume 2, they're more. We get to change these characters, and I think that's part of the appeal of doing creator-owned, but also doing a limited run creator-owned series. A lot of people over at Image who they've said, we've done 60 issue epics, and if we could go back in time, we'd probably only do 16 issues. I get it. Even if you're the best creator there is, people run out of things to say about you. And it's easy to sort of forget what traits you have, what arcs you have. I mean, that was an issue I had with Transmetropolitan, which is one of my favorite series. But it took me a million years to get the whole trade collection because I didn't know which volumes I already owned. We want to make sure that we don't overstay our welcome with this series, but to make sure that the full arc for these characters we accomplish. And that was the thing that Jorge and I discussed when we decided to do a sequel, was I said, I have an idea for 2 to 3 more arcs. I really want to keep you on board. Here's my plan. And thankfully, I was able to convince him to stick around. But yes, there are definitely more stories to tell. Sort of by virtue of the high concept, we're able to kind of take these characters and put them in different situations and circumstances with different supporting characters. So this is the tip of the iceberg now. There's a whole lot of other places that Spencer and Locke can go as long as the demand is there.
Well, I'm sure it is. I read the first issue. I couldn't put it down. I kept going through the trade, flipped through it so quickly. I'm sure the demand is out there. Now, on top of all this, aren't you also working on another comic series?
I'm working on 2 right now. We announced Grand Theft Astro over the summer at San Diego Comic-Con. That's going to be a fun sci-fi series that I'm working on with artist Jordi Perez. The easy elevator pitch, and I guess I have a pattern. This is very much Fast and the Furious meets Back to the Future. It's about a space racer named Hakeem Henriksen who accidentally tears open a wormhole in space, pops out the other side 7 years later. He now gets to navigate how his friends and family and his world have changed, because for them it's been 7 years, but for him it's just been the blink of an eye. So he's going to wind up having to go on a pretty daring high-speed heist with his formerly younger brother, who is now turned into a crime lord. They're going to have to go on a big heist if he ever hopes to make it home to his home era. So it's very exciting. We're very early on in the stages of that book. It's actually still being written, but what Jordi has turned around so far has been just really terrific, kinetic, high-speed sci-fi work, and I'm very excited with how that book's going to turn out. And then I can't say too much about it. We should be announcing it soon, though. I do have another series that'll be coming out later this year following Spencer and Locke 2. And without giving too much away, we do share a certain sense of humor with Spencer and Locke, but I decided that nobody had ever really tried to do rom-coms in direct market comics. So this is going to be a rom-com from the creator of Spencer and Locke. So take that as you will, but I'm very excited for that to come out. The art is finished. It's beautiful. So we should be announcing that book shortly.
My interest is piqued, but I'm more trying to figure out, when do you sleep? When do you rest?
Very infrequently. Things are getting busier than ever. But honestly, I couldn't be more grateful to be this exhausted. It took me 10 years to muster up the gumption to try writing my first book. This could have ended very badly. I could be back in an office gig any minute now. But thanks to readers like you, I'm sticking it out. This is the best job in the world. And I couldn't be more grateful to all the people who have supported us getting here.
Well, I am going to be continuing to support you in all these stories, and I hope no matter how big you get, you still have time to come back and talk about all of these great stories that are coming out.
You got it.
Where can everybody pre-order these next issues?
So you can pre-order the first issue of Spencer and Locke 2 now. You just call your local comic shop and you give them the code FEB191309. That's for Jorge Santiago Jr.'s main cover. Or you can give them the code FEB191310 for Mon House's variant, or Feb 191311 for Joe Mulvey's red, white, and blue variant. That one is quite eye-catching in my opinion. But they're all terrific covers. All three of our artists were really trying hard to one-up one another, and the winner is the readers. You can just visit comicshoplocator.com and just input your zip code, and they'll find you your nearest comic shop. And then you can follow Spencer and Locke. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. It's just Spencer and Locke. It's one word. The ampersand is spelled out as an and. And then you can follow me on Twitter. It's just Pepose D. It's my last name and first initial. And Jorge is on Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr as Jorge Santiago Jr. That is one word. But like I said, thank you to everyone who's been listening and been following us. And please pre-order. That is really kind of what makes or breaks books like ours. We're working with a small publisher. Every pre-order counts. Every pre-order helps. Enough pre-orders and we'll get yourselves a Spencer and Locke 3.
Show up and show out with those pre-order numbers, please. Well, thank you so much, David, again for coming on and talking with me about your series. I can't wait to hear more about your $1 million ideas coming down the pipeline.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks again to David for coming on WhatItDo and talking with me. If you'd like to find out more about our show, you can head on over to WhatItDoPodcast.com for all of our social media, past episodes, and more. Until next time, WhatItDo, done it again.